The history of London begins long before the Roman city of Londinium. The land where the metropolis is located today was inhabited by people in prehistoric times. Archaeological finds show that the first human settlements on the banks of the Thames appeared more than 6,000 years ago in the Neolithic era. The area was inhabited by tribes engaged in hunting, fishing, and gathering. Later, with the development of agriculture, local people began to cultivate the land and raise livestock. In the Bronze and Iron Ages on the territory of the future, London settled Celtic tribes which actively traded with continental Europe. They lived in fortified settlements known as hill forts and built earth forts to protect themselves from enemies. This region was dominated by the tribe of the Tribates, one of the many Celtic peoples of Britain. These tribes were known for their craft skills, especially in metalworking, and traded extensively with the Gauls who lived in what is now France. One of the most important factors that predetermined the future of London was its geographical location. The River Thames served as a natural transportation route, providing a link between the interior of Britain and the North Sea. This made the future territory of the city attractive for trade and settlement. In 43 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius began a full-scale conquest of Britain. For the Roman Empire, this campaign was not only a military venture, but also an economic move. Britain was rich in metals, especially tin, which was used to make bronze. When the Romans landed in Britain, they quickly advanced inland, capturing key settlements. The area of future London was a strategically important point because it was at the crossroads of trade routes. Soon the Romans founded the city of Londinium, choosing a convenient location on the north bank of the Thames. They built a wooden bridge across the river, which became an important part of their road network, connecting Londinium with other Roman cities such as Camulodunum, modern Colchester, and Verulamium, St. Albans. At first, Londinium was a small military camp, but due to its advantageous location, it quickly became a major trading center. The Romans brought with them advanced building technology. Stone buildings, paved streets, and even sewers began to appear. Trade flourished as goods from the Roman Empire passed through Londinium: wine, olive oil, glass, and ceramics. Despite the Romans' successes, their power in Britain was not unchallenged. Local Celtic tribes, especially the Iceni led by Queen Boudica, opposed Roman rule. The cause of the revolt was brutal repression by the Roman authorities. After the death of Boudica's husband, the Romans annexed the lands of the Iceni, brutally suppressing any resistance. In 60 AD, Boudica led the largest revolt against the Romans in Britain. Her troops captured and destroyed Camulodunum, Colchester, then moved on Londinium. The city did not have adequate fortifications because the Roman governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was busy suppressing rebellions in Wales. He decided not to defend Londinium but to evacuate its inhabitants. The rebellious Celts captured the city and burned it to the ground, killing thousands of Romans and their allies. However, the rebellion was short-lived. The Roman legions soon defeated the army of Boudica, and she herself, according to various sources, either died in battle or poisoned herself to avoid capture. After the rebellion was crushed, the Romans began rebuilding Londinium. They not only rebuilt the city, but also turned it into the largest administrative center of Britain. During the 2nd century AD, Londinium became a thriving city of about 60,000 people, a huge metropolis for those times. The main buildings of the time included Forum and Basilica, the center of city life where trade was conducted and justice was administered. Amphitheater, a place for gladiatorial fights and public entertainment. Temples and shrines dedicated to the Roman gods, including Jupiter and Minerva. Roman baths, public places that served not only for washing but also for social gatherings. One of the most important achievements of the Romans was the construction of the London Wall at the end of the 2nd century. This massive fortress wall, more than 3 kilometers long, protected the city from possible barbarian attacks and remained an important element of defense even in the Middle Ages. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire began to weaken. Pressure from Germanic tribes on the continent forced the Romans to withdraw some troops from Britain. Gradually, Londinium fell into decline. Trade declined, buildings deteriorated, and the Roman administration lost control of the province. In 410 AD, the last Roman governor of Britain sent a letter to Emperor Honorius asking for help, but was refused. Soon the Romans finally left Britain, leaving Londinium unprotected. The city began to empty rapidly, and for several centuries almost no one lived here. After the Romans left, Britain experienced a tumultuous period of barbarian invasions. In the 5th to 6th centuries, the Anglo-Saxons, tribes that came from the territories of modern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, began to penetrate these lands. They settled the neighborhood of Londinium, but the city itself remained abandoned for a long time. Only by the 7th century, Anglo-Saxons began to repopulate London, giving it a new name, Lundenburg. Thus, the history of London went through several stages, from small Celtic settlements in the Roman metropolis to its destruction and subsequent revival by the Anglo-Saxons. In the future, this city faced many more trials, but it had already shown its ability to survive and revive. Medieval London, 5th to 15th centuries. After the departure of the Romans in the early 5th century, Britain found itself in an extremely difficult position. The Roman Empire, going through one of the most difficult periods in its history, was forced to withdraw its troops from the British Isles in 410, leaving them undefended. This was part of a wider process involving the weakening of the empire at the turn of the 4th to 5th centuries. The Romans, although they left a legacy of infrastructure, roads, cities, and cultural achievements, were unable to keep Britain under their control. Roman Britain, once an important part of the empire, became vulnerable to external threats. As a result of this withdrawal, Britannia fell into a period of instability and destruction. After the departure of the Roman legions, Britain found itself defenseless against the invasion of Germanic tribes, who began to migrate intensively to the island. During this period, from the end of the 4th century and throughout the 5th century, the invasion of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes began, marking a major milestone in the island's history. The reasons for these migrations were related to both the internal problems of the Germanic tribes and the political and economic instability of the Roman Empire. Germanic tribes in what is now known as Germany and Scandinavia were looking for new lands to settle, and Britain, with its rich land and comparatively weak defenses after the Romans left, was an attractive target for their migration. The process of conquest was lengthy and often involved fierce battles. However, one of the most significant aspects of the process was that the conquerors not only fought but also integrated into the local culture. The Anglo-Saxon tribes played an important role in this process, not only capturing the territory but also beginning to actively develop it, creating new settlements and developing agriculture. One of the symbols of the decline of Roman Britain was Londinium, the capital of the Roman province of Britain, which was located on the site of modern London. During the period of Roman prosperity, Londinium was an important commercial and administrative center, a city in which the political and economic life of the island was concentrated. With the departure of the Romans, however, the situation changed. Londinium, once famous for its powerful fortifications, markets, theaters, and forums, was forgotten and destroyed. The city, deprived of Roman administration and protection, gradually fell into disrepair. The Roman buildings began to crumble, the streets became desolate, and many of the locals left the once prosperous city. The decline of Londinium came to symbolize the end of the Roman era in Britain. Almost all signs of Roman civilization, such as Roman baths, roads, and architectural structures, ceased to exist. Roman buildings were replaced by more primitive structures, and towns in many areas of Britain became small settlements that could not regain their former grandeur. The symbolic moment for the end of the Roman era in Britain came in 410, when Emperor Honorius, weakened by the internal and external problems of the Roman Empire, officially withdrew the Roman legions from the British Isles. This decision was the result of the need to protect the central parts of the empire, including Italy, from barbarian tribes that were increasingly threatening Rome. Instead of Roman legions, Germanic tribes came to British soil, and with their arrival, a new era began. However, despite this, Britain did not remain empty and abandoned. Already in the 7th century, on the place of the destroyed Roman Londinium, a new city, Lundenburg, arose. This was not just a rebuilding of the old city, but the creation of a new settlement that quickly became an important center of trade, crafts, and culture. The new settlers, the Anglo-Saxons, inherited the best features of Roman architecture, even though they brought their own traditions and ways of building into the process. Lundenburg became one of the most important cities on the east coast of Britain, its strategic location on the River Thames playing a key role in the development of trade and exchange. The river provided access to the sea, which facilitated the growth of trade with other regions of Britain and beyond. It is important to note that the Anglo-Saxons, in rebuilding London, not only used Roman technology and infrastructure, but adapted it to new conditions, allowing the city to once again become an important center in Anglo-Saxon Britain. Lundenburg, like many other Anglo-Saxon settlements, was part of a wider process of forming Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each seeking to expand their territories and consolidate their power. London became part of the Kingdom of Essex, one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that was actively developing and consolidating its position in the 7th and 8th centuries. London, which had previously been just one of the many provincial capitals of the Roman Empire, now became an important political and economic center for the Anglo-Saxons. In the 7th century, London was already a strong and prosperous city, despite all the turmoil that Britain had experienced during the late Roman and early Anglo-Saxon period. With the development of Lundenburg, a new era began for London. The city managed to regain a key place on the map of Britain, thanks to its strategic location and the efforts of the Anglo-Saxons to rebuild and expand its infrastructure. However, despite the revival, London was still much smaller than the Roman Londinium, and the locals retained elements of ancient Roman culture and technology, gradually integrating them into their lives. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the early 5th century, Britain underwent major changes that affected almost every aspect of its life. With the departure of the Roman legions and administrative power, the island found itself in a state of political and social disorganization. From that time until the 7th century, chaos reigned in Britain, especially on its eastern coast. Gradually, Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, came to the land of the British archipelago. They not only invaded Britain, but also began to form new political entities based on Anglo-Saxon culture. Under these conditions, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms such as Essex, Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria emerged, which later played a key role in the history of Britain. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Essex, Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria. After the Romans left, Britain found itself in a political vacuum, with power struggles between various Germanic tribes. Essex, Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria, these four main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, became major players in the political life of early medieval Britain. However, due to constant internecine wars and struggles for supremacy on the island, the unification of these territories into a single Anglo-Saxon kingdom was not possible for a long time. Essex. This one of the oldest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms located in southeastern Britain also became an important center of Christianization. In the 7th century, after the adoption of Christianity, Essex became one of the leading regions where the first Christian churches and monasteries were actively built. Essex also played a key role in military clashes with other kingdoms, particularly Mercia and Wessex, throughout much of the 7th and 8th centuries. Mercia. Mercia, located in central Britain, had long been the strongest and most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom. It was a major rival to other kingdoms such as Wessex. For several centuries, Mercia expanded its borders and influenced neighboring areas. Of particular importance to Mercia in British history are its religious achievements. In the 7th century, King Peter converted to Christianity, which became the basis for the spread of the faith in the kingdom. Wessex. While Mercia and Essex were rivals, Wessex, with its location in the southwestern part of the island, also played an important role in the process of shaping the Anglo-Saxon political structure. Wessex, due to its natural resources and strategy, gradually became one of the most important centers in the period after the 7th century. It became the nucleus of resistance in the struggle against the Danes in the 9th century and eventually one of the main centers of the Anglo-Saxon state. Northumbria. The Kingdom of Northumbria, located in the northeast of Britain, was an important center of not only political but also cultural life. In particular, Northumbria is known as a center of Christian propaganda in the 7th century, where many monasteries were built, which later became important centers of education and culture. In addition, Northumbria played a key role in the spread of writing throughout Anglo-Saxon Britain, thanks to the monasteries and monastic communities that were active in cultural and scholarly activities. One of the most significant processes that took place in Britain during the Anglo-Saxon era was Christianization. While Roman Britain was Christianized as early as the 4th century, with the departure of the Romans and the invasion of Germanic tribes, this process ceased. But with the arrival of Christian missionaries in the 6th to 7th centuries in Britain, began the second wave of Christianization, which eventually had a huge impact on the entire future history of the country. By the 7th century, when the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had already begun to strengthen, the process of Christianization became particularly active. Anglo-Saxon kings such as Ethelberta of Kent began to embrace Christianity, which allowed them to receive support from Rome and other Christian kingdoms in Europe. Christian mission in Britain began with missionaries sent by Pope Gregory I in 597, when St. Augustine of Canterbury was sent to England to preach Christianity among the Anglo-Saxons. His efforts led to the acceptance of Christianity by King Ethelbert of Kent, which had a great impact on neighboring kingdoms. Christianity gradually spread throughout the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, including Essex, Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria. London, as a major commercial and cultural center, became an important place for Christianization. The first Christian churches and monasteries began to be built in the city, on the site of the old Roman Londinium, a significant symbol of the transition from pagan Anglo-Saxon culture to the Christian tradition. It is important to note that Christianization also meant cultural renewal. Christianity brought with it not only religious rituals, but also new forms of education, art, and writing, which played an important role in the formation of Anglo-Saxon civilization. After the destruction of the Roman Londinium in the 5th century, London was abandoned for a long time. However, in the 7th century, when the Anglo-Saxons began active development of the territory, a new center, Lundenburg, began to develop on the site of the old city. The rebirth of London was not just the rebuilding of a ruined Roman city, but the establishment of an important new city on the map of Anglo-Saxon Britain. London's strategic location on the River Thames played a key role in its rebuilding. The river provided a convenient route for trade and transportation of goods, which made London an important center of economic life. By the 8th century, Lundenburg had already begun to develop rapidly and attract merchants and artisans. An important point was also the fact that London became not only a commercial but also a religious center, in which Christian churches and monasteries were actively built. Christianization brought to the city not only spiritual values but also new architectural forms, including Christian monasteries and churches. London, becoming part of Essex and then other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, began to gradually take an important place in the political life of Britain. The kings of Essex and other kingdoms, given the importance of London as a commercial and religious center, sought to increase their control over the city. By the 9th century, London had already become one of the key cities of Anglo-Saxon Britain. One of the most important consequences of Christianization for London and the whole of Britain was the development of education and writing. In the 8th and 10th centuries, monasteries became centers of education, teaching not only religious subjects but also grammar, rhetoric, and the scholarly works of ancient authors. This played a key role in preserving the ancient heritage and in further influencing the development of European science and culture. London became an important center for the spread of writing, and the first books began to be created in the city, as well as translations into Anglo-Saxon. As a result of this cultural revival, London became not only the economic and political but also the cultural center of all of Anglo-Saxon Britain. In the 9th century, London and other parts of England faced a serious threat, the Viking invasions, which brought destruction and death. Originally, Vikings, who were maritime tribes, began their raids on the British Isles in the late 8th century. In 793, the Vikings attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, which was the beginning of their long trek across Britain and the rest of Europe. Monasteries and towns became easy targets for these ruthless conquerors, who used their fast Drakkar ships to suddenly attack the coast and threaten entire regions. With each passing year, the Vikings became more organized and their attacks became more frequent and powerful. In 842, the Vikings began their raids on London, which was already an important trading and cultural center of Anglo-Saxon Britain. In 851, their forces attacked again, ravaging the city, marking another milestone in the history of these brutal invasions. These early attacks, however, were only part of a broader process in which the Danes and Norwegians, armed with their experience in sea campaigns and conquests, began to threaten entire regions of Anglo-Saxon Britain. By the middle of the 9th century, the Vikings already controlled significant territories in eastern England and began to capture important cities, including London. In 871, the Danish forces carried out another larger-scale conquest of London. This event was a landmark moment in the history of the city and the country. The Danish invaders, who influenced much of southeastern Britain, acted with determination, and their campaigns brought destruction and death to the region. By this time, the Vikings were well established in Britain, and their conquest had become an integral part of the island's political and social structure. The complex relations between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Viking threats were bringing England to the brink of political crisis. London was under the control of the Danes at this point, and this was crucial to their strategy, as the city was not only an important trading center, but also a key point on the way to the richer regions of England. Control of London gave the Danes a significant advantage in their war with the Anglo-Saxons, as well as the opportunity for further attacks and territorial expansion. The situation in Britain began to change in the late 9th century when King Alfred the Great, ruler of the Kingdom of Wessex, began to fight for independence from the Danes. His reign, which began in 871, marked a new era in the struggle of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms against the Vikings. Alfred the Great proved to be one of the greatest rulers in the history of England, and his strategy in the fight against the Vikings became the basis for the preservation of Anglo-Saxon independence. Born in 849, Alfred the Great was the son of King Ethelweda the Great and heir to the throne of Wessex. Early in his reign, he faced pressure from the Danes, who were already strong and had strategic positions in the southeast of England. In 871, when Alfred became king, the Vikings began an active invasion of the kingdom, leading to a number of bloody battles. However, Alfred proved himself as a strategist and military leader, winning several major battles against the Danes. After this victory, Alfred began plans for a long-term defense of Wessex and all of Britain against the Danes. However, a decisive event occurred in 886 when Alfred the Great, who had already proven his leadership skills in battle, decided to retake London from the control of the Danes. London at that time was severely weakened and destroyed after long attacks, and the rebuilding of the city was not just the restoration of its physical structure, but also a symbol of the return of independence for the entire Kingdom of Wessex. Alfred the Great successfully organized a military operation to rebuild London. To do so, he fortified the old Roman defenses, reinforcing them with new fortifications. These fortifications played a crucial role in further strengthening the city's defenses. Alfred also organized a system of burghs, fortified towns that served as both defenses and administrative centers for the Anglo-Saxon population. The burgh system was not only a military strategy, but also an important element of the social and political structure of Anglo-Saxon Britain. These cities became the basis for the future revival of Anglo-Saxon statehood in Britain. Alfred, unlike many other rulers of his time, understood the importance of not only military power but also administrative stability. He initiated the creation of an effective system of administration and legal structures that strengthened control over the territories liberated from the Vikings. These steps allowed London to regain its role as an important commercial and cultural center, and ensured its strategic importance to the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. After London was rebuilt, Alfred the Great continued to work on its development, improving the city's infrastructure and strengthening its defenses. He also implemented a system of laws that helped the city prosper and grow. London became an important center not only for military life but also for trade, which attracted many Anglo-Saxon artisans and merchants. Due to its strategic position on the River Thames, the city again became an important trading hub. Culture also began to flourish in London as Alfred the Great actively supported education and scientific research. He organized a school at court and also promoted the Latin language and Christian teachings. Alfred understood the importance of writing and education for the future of his kingdom, and his reign was a time of cultural and educational renaissance. Alfred the Great not only brought London back, but also provided England with long-term stability. His reign laid the foundations for a unified Anglo-Saxon kingdom that was able to resist the Vikings and strengthen its independence. After his death in 899, his son Edward the Elder and Alfred's grandson, Alfred II, continued his work to unify England and fight the Danes, which eventually led to the formation of England as a single state. He also played an important role in the religious and cultural life of England. His reforms and support for education provided the basis for the cultural development of the Anglo-Saxon period, as manifested in the building of monasteries and churches and the support of scientific and literary works. His efforts to reclaim London and restore Anglo-Saxon power and culture made him one of the most significant rulers in British history. Alfred the Great became an important historical figure not only for London but for all of Britain. His efforts to retake London from Danish control and rebuild the city not only strengthened its strategic importance but also made it a symbol of Anglo-Saxon power and independence. Alfred the Great also laid the foundations for the future unification of England and its cultural revival. He was not only a military strategist but also a reformer who understood the importance of education, culture, and the legal system for the prosperity of his kingdom. In 1066, Anglo-Saxon Britain experienced one of the most significant events in its history, the Norman Conquest. The Norman Duke William the Conqueror invaded England, defeated the Anglo-Saxon King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, and became the new ruler of the island. This historic event proved to be a turning point in the history of London, which, like the rest of England, experienced significant changes. Around the same period, from the end of the 11th century, London became the center of Norman royal power, undergoing significant changes, both socially and culturally. The Norman Conquest and the beginning of William the Conqueror's reign. The Norman Conquest in 1066 was the culmination of a long struggle for the English throne. After the death of Edward the Confessor, King of England, a fierce struggle between the claimants began. Among them were Duke William of Normandy, whom Edward had promised to make heir before his death, and Harold II, who was supported by the Anglo-Saxon nobility. Harold won the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but was soon defeated at the Battle of Hastings in October 1066 by Norman forces, ending Anglo-Saxon rule in England. Following this victory, William conquered key cities, including London. However, the conquest of London was not as direct and swift as that of other regions of England. The city resisted the Normans, causing conflict, but its elite and most of the citizens soon recognized William as king, realizing his undeniable military might. In December 1066, just 2 months after the victory at Hastings, William was crowned at Westminster Abbey as King of England. After the conquest, William began to introduce new feudal orders, including in London. The system of feudalism characteristic of Normandy included the transfer of lands and resources to vassals, nobles and knights who were obliged to serve their lord, including in warfare. This process of land redistribution significantly changed the social and economic structure of London, as well as the rest of England. London continued to be the most important commercial and administrative center, but under Norman rule the city acquired new features, including architectural and cultural. William the Conqueror realized the importance of the city and decided to use it to consolidate his power. London became not only a political center, but also a symbol of Norman royal power in England. One of the most significant events during the reign of William the Conqueror was the construction of the Tower, one of the most famous fortresses in the world, which is still a symbol of British royalty and power. Construction began immediately after William's coronation in 1066, and the tower, located at a strategic location by the River Thames, became an important defensive and administrative fortress. The tower was built to demonstrate the strength and power of the Normans. This fortress became not only the residence of the king, but also the seat of state regalia, the treasury, and prisons where high-profile prisoners were held. During William's period, the tower became a symbol of royal power that served both a defensive and administrative purpose. In addition to the tower, William ordered the construction of other castles throughout England, consolidating his power and controlling key territories. William's strategy was to consolidate his position in England through the creation of castles that served not only as military fortifications, but also as political symbols. William the Conqueror and his successors introduced a system of feudalism that fundamentally changed the social and economic structure of England. Under the feudal system, land and resources were given to vassals who had to be loyal to the king and do his bidding. In London, as in other parts of England, this led to land redistribution, with local Anglo-Saxon nobles and landowners losing their rights and lands in favor of Norman vassals. Knowledge of landholdings and property status in England was compiled in the famous Domesday Book, which was compiled in 1086, almost 20 years after the Norman conquest. The book contained detailed information about the property, taxes, economic situation, and population of England, including London. It became an important tool for the Norman administration, allowing William and his successors to effectively manage the conquered lands and tax collection. The feudal system also led to social changes in London. A new elite took the place of the old Anglo-Saxon nobles who had been displaced by the Norman nobles. Nevertheless, London continued to be an important center of trade, and local artisans and merchants played an important role in the city's economy. The Normans did not destroy the old infrastructure of the city, but merely adapted it to the new conditions. London during the Norman era became the official residence of the king and the most important political center of England. William the Conqueror, realizing the importance of this city, promoted the development of its infrastructure. London continued to develop as a center of trade and business, and its strategic location on the River Thames provided an important location for water transportation, which facilitated increased trade and cultural ties with other regions. The Normans also strengthened the system of local government in London. The city was divided into various administrative units such as stotts, hundreds, which became important centers of local government. These changes improved the city's manageability and allowed for the efficient collection of taxes and the administration of justice. The Norman kings also began to exert great influence over churches and monasteries. After the conquest, several major Christian buildings were built in London, including Westminster Abbey, which became not only a religious but also a political center. In 1066, as mentioned, William was crowned in Westminster Abbey, an important symbol of his power. For many years, Westminster remained the site of coronations and political life. Under the Normans, London and England as a whole underwent significant cultural changes. The Norman conquerors brought French culture and language to England, and for centuries French was the language of the royal court as well as the legal and administrative language. English nobles and knights began to borrow French manners, culture, architecture, and fashion, which had a profound effect on the development of Anglo-Saxon culture. Norman rulers also promoted the spread of the Catholic religion, which encouraged the construction of new church buildings and monasteries. An important element of this cultural influence was architecture. Norman architecture, with its massive stone structures and fortifications, had a lasting influence on the style of building in England. The Tower of London, with its powerful walls and imposing towers, became a model for later buildings. The Norman conquest and the reign of William the Conqueror were crucial moments in the history of London and England. William not only conquered the land, but also created a new administrative system that left lasting marks on the political, social, and cultural life of the country. London became the most important symbol of Norman power and the development of the feudal system, and the tower became the fortress that epitomized royal authority. As a result of the Norman conquest, London strengthened its position as a political and economic center, and its influence on the future history of England was unalterably great. By the 12th century, London had already become the most important commercial and economic center of England. The city's strategic location on the River Thames facilitated trade and provided easy access to sea routes, which provided the basis for a thriving local economy. During this time, London was undergoing a significant transformation, that included the growth of craft guilds, the construction of markets, the development of city government, and the consolidation of political influence over the whole country. This period also saw the active development of important institutions that became an integral part of urban life and influenced the political structure of England. London was not only an administrative center, but also the most important trading center of medieval England. Its economic position was due to its favorable location on the River Thames, which provided convenient access to international trade routes. Numerous maritime trade routes intersected in this region, linking England with Europe, Scandinavia, and even the East. With the development of trade in London in the 12th century, begins the formation of such important markets as the London market, where goods coming not only from England but also from other countries were sold. The main goods that came to the city were wool, furs, salt, agricultural products, as well as metals and textiles. Products made in London were actively exported to other regions. The city's artisan workshops produced high-quality products such as ceramics, textiles, and metalwork. London's shopping rows became an essential part of city life. They served not only as a place for the exchange of goods, but also as a center of social activity. Merchants, artisans, and merchants formed a powerful group that not only controlled the city's economy, but also participated in its governance. Guilds, which flourished at this time, played a key role in organizing the city's trade and ensuring control over the quality of goods. Every artisan or merchant was required to become a member of a guild, which provided rules for trade and regulated workshops and stores. The 12th century also saw the development of the city's infrastructure. Warehouses were built around the market and trading rows, and bridges and roads were constructed to facilitate trade and provide access for goods to other parts of the country and beyond. London became an important transit point where routes from all over England converged. Guilds of artisans and merchants became an important element of London's urban structure in the 12th century. These associations were not only engaged in trade and craft production, but also became the main institutions governing social and economic processes in the city. Guild members came together to protect their interests, set quality standards, and regulate trade. Guilds were involved in various fields of activity. Blacksmiths, carpenters, tanners, tailors, and other craftsmen had their own organizations that controlled the production and sale of goods. Guilds also engaged in social work, including helping their members in times of need, including illness or death. At a higher level in late medieval England, guilds had considerable political influence. Guild members participated in the election of city representatives and also played an important role in decisions concerning the rules of trade and the organization of city life. Of particular importance in London were the merchant guilds, which controlled much of the city's trade. Their influence in the political life of the city continued to grow, and they were major players in the process that led to the creation of a more complex and organized urban structure. In the 12th century, London began to develop elements of self-government, which played a key role in its emergence as an important political and administrative center of England. In 1191, under King Richard the Lionheart, the Corporation of London was officially recognized. This was an important step in the development of city government, as the city acquired a legal status that allowed it to manage its own affairs. The recognition of the Corporation of London meant that the city began to have its own power structures and administrative bodies. Thus, London became an important example for other cities in England, demonstrating that cities could organize and manage their internal life based on the principles of self-government. In this context, the Guild of Merchants and Craftsmen played an important role as the main forces governing the city. One of the most important moments in the history of London was the introduction of the institution of the mayor. This was particularly important for the city, as the mayor became not only a symbol of authority, but also the person representing the interests of the citizens in their dealings with the royalty. He was elected by the guilds and merchants, and had an important role in regulating trade, public order, and taxation. The election of a mayor became an important part of the city's tradition, strengthening London's position as an important political and economic center. In 1215, King John the Landless signed the Magna Carta, which became one of the most important documents in English history. The charter limited the power of the king and asserted the rights and liberties of all free people in the kingdom. The Magna Carta also confirmed the privileges of London, which meant that the city had a number of important rights and freedoms, including the right to choose its own mayor. The Great Charter played a huge role in the political life of the city, as it confirmed the rights of the citizens to self-government. It gave London more political autonomy, strengthening its status as an important administrative and economic center. The king, who signed the charter, was forced to recognize that London had a certain degree of independence, especially in matters of city government. The guarantee of the right to choose a mayor gave the citizens greater influence over the internal affairs of the city. While the king's power continued to remain in the hands of the monarch, the city became more independent and self-sufficient. This also helped to strengthen the position of the guilds, which were involved in the formation of local government. The mayor became an important figure in city life, and his role was important both in matters of self-government and the security of the city. In the 13th century, London became not only an important economic center, but also one of England's key political hubs. The city attracted merchants, artisans, and politicians from all over the country and abroad. At this time, the city's infrastructure continued to grow. New bridges, roads, and buildings were built, boosting trade and improving the quality of life. London's self-government was becoming increasingly independent. The entire city administration, including the mayor, city officials, and judges, aimed to run the city efficiently and strengthen its political role in England. Although the king's authority remained supreme, London was no longer completely under his control, but rather became an important partner in the governance of the country. It should also be noted that during this time, London continued to play an important role in the development of international trade. Goods arrived here from all over Europe, as well as from the East. The prosperity of trade, the growth of urban infrastructure, and political consolidation meant that London continued to be the most important center of political and economic life in England. By the 13th century, London had become one of the most powerful and influential cities in England. Due to its strategic location, the active development of trade, the creation of guilds, and the strengthening of city government, the city became an important center of not only economic but also political life. The recognition of the Corporation of London, the introduction of the office of mayor, and the adoption of the Great Charter of Liberties were important milestones that allowed London to take a central place in the life of England, strengthening its status as the most important political and economic center. The 14th century was a time of considerable challenge, tragedy, and change for London. The city, which had undergone many changes over the previous centuries, faced devastating catastrophes that profoundly affected its future destiny. In particular, two major events, the Black Death epidemic in 1348 and Wat Tyler's rebellion in 1381, changed the face of London and influenced political and social processes in England. These events became the most important moments in the history of the city, epitomizing the complex transitions through which London and the whole of England went during the Middle Ages. One of the most devastating events for London and the rest of Europe was the Black Death epidemic, plague pandemic, that swept the continent in the mid-14th century. The plague arrived in England in 1348, and London became one of the largest hotspots for the spread of the disease. The disease, which was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, was transmitted through fleas living on rats and quickly covered vast areas. The Black Death killed nearly half of London's population. According to various estimates, the city lost about 50 to 60% of its residents within a few months. This catastrophic death rate shook the entire social and economic fabric of the city. Many houses, stores, and stores were abandoned, and the streets of the city became frighteningly empty. Trade declined, and the artisans, merchants, and laborers who made up the bulk of the city's economy either died or left the city in an attempt to escape the epidemic. The streets of London, once lively and crowded, now resembled a place covered in the shadow of death. People abandoned the usual funeral rituals as the number of deaths was so great that it became impossible to organize them in the usual order. Even the clergy were affected by the deadly virus, which weakened the church's influence on society and brought additional hardship to the lives of the townspeople. Unemployment and poverty increased rapidly, The fall in population had a serious impact on the city's economy. London, as an important trading center, greatly reduced its commercial activity. Markets emptied, many traders and merchants died or left, and those who remained struggled to survive. It should be noted, however, that among the remaining residents there was a tendency for certain categories of residents to improve their economic situation, such as landowners, who began to make greater profits from agriculture in the face of labor shortages. While many farmers died, land formerly occupied by peasants passed into the hands of those who were able to survive the epidemic. Land prices skyrocketed, as did farm incomes. The Black Death also led to a significant decrease in the labor force, affecting the construction industry and manufacturing. Agriculture suffered, and workshops and businesses could not operate at the same volume as before. Nevertheless, in the long run, the labor shortage caused wages to rise, which influenced a change in the social structure of society and improved the situation of peasants and urban workers. In addition, the epidemic dealt a blow to the church's authority. The church, which at that time was considered the main institution that guided the moral and spiritual foundations of society, failed to protect people from the plague. Against this background, there was a wave of discontent against the clergy, which undermined religious influence. At this time, anti-church sentiment and freer views on religion increased in London. During the Black Death, medical knowledge was extremely limited, and doctors were unable to effectively combat the disease. The main methods of treatment were bloodletting, the use of herbs, and prayer. People, not understanding the causes of the disease, sought various methods of defense, including prayers, magic, and rituals, to get rid of the plague. These methods were not only unhelpful, but sometimes made the situation worse. Avoiding infection remained the only way to protect against the disease. Many families and homes were left stranded, and infected people died alone. London faced a tragic episode when death became commonplace. As a consequence, the city needed new ways to adapt to life after the epidemic. Another significant event that shook London in the 14th century was Wat Tyler's Rebellion of 1381. This rebellion was one of the largest peasant revolutions in English history, reflecting the tensions between the poor and the government, as well as the feudal system that oppressed peasants and city dwellers. By the 13th and 14th centuries, England had a brutal social and economic hierarchy in which wealth and power were concentrated in the hands of a narrow elite, and the majority of peasants and urban workers suffered poverty and exploitation. Problems such as high taxes, inflation, and inhumane treatment by landowners created deep contradictions in society. However, one of the main factors that led to the rebellion was the introduction of new taxes in 1377, which placed a heavy burden on peasants and townspeople. The tax, known as the half tax, was imposed in the midst of an economic crisis caused by the effects of the Black Death and internal social problems. The tax was difficult to pay, and its increase was the last straw that sparked popular outrage. Wat Tyler, the leader of the rebellion, led an army of peasants that marched towards London. Thousands of protesters from the countryside came to the capital to express their discontent and demand a change in the feudal order. On the day the rebels arrived in London, they stormed the city, destroyed several government buildings, and seized key locations, including the Tower. The rebellion became massive, and people demanded that King Richard II remove the privileges of the aristocracy and lower the tax burden. Wat Tyler and his supporters demanded that the king recognize their demands and eliminate feudal taxes. During the revolt, the king's treasurer was killed, as well as other high-ranking officials. The anger of the mob was directed against the representatives of the government who, according to the peasants, stood in the way of their economic and social improvement. In response to the threat, King Richard II decided to meet with the leaders of the rebellion and negotiate. At this point, however, a tragic incident occurred when Wat Tyler was killed. Tyler's death ended the rebellion, and the king's forces quickly crushed the remaining resistance. The leaders of the rebellion were executed, and King Richard II promised to fulfill their demands, but in reality this did not happen. After the rebellion was put down, life in London returned to normal. But the memory of the rebellion and the demands made by its participants remained alive for many years. Special attention should be paid to the emergence of the first banks in London, which began to provide services, not only serving the royal court and the wealthy aristocracy, but also supporting the city's growing commerce. These first banks became the foundation of the future City of London, a financial district that in a few centuries would become one of the leading financial centers of the world. One of the characteristic features of London's financial institutions was that they began to develop lending methods that allowed trade and industry to accelerate. Banks extended credit to merchants and manufacturers, which helped to increase economic activity. Most importantly, such lending organizations began to form long-term financial ties with European trading partners. In the 15th century, London continued to develop as a city with a large population. Its size grew, and in connection with this, the density of building increased. The construction of new houses, churches, and administrative buildings helped to strengthen the urban structure. An important element in the social development of London was the growth of guilds, which played an important role in organizing craft production and trade. The guilds also influenced city politics, and many craftsmen became part of the city government. As time went on, London became active in strengthening and organizing city government. As early as the 15th century, London had a complex system of government consisting of various organizations such as the mayor's office, the city chamber, and other administrative structures. London was the first city in England to develop and implement an effective mechanism of self-government, which was an important factor in strengthening its position in the country. In the 15th century, London became the cultural center of England. With the development of the city, theaters, educational institutions, libraries, and art workshops began to appear in it. An important cultural event was the opening of the National Library in 1477, which in the future would play an important role in the preservation of knowledge and the development of science in England. One of the most important cultural events of this period was the development of English literature, particularly through the work of John Lydgate, who lived and worked in London. At this time, moreover, London became a center for new ideas and intellectual currents that shaped the future of English culture. By the end of the 15th century, London was flourishing, but its achievements were not limited to trade and political power. The city also became a cultural and financial center that paved the way for the Renaissance and the Tudor era. London was more than just a place of trade and an administrative center. It was becoming a crucial arena where political, economic, and cultural forces interacted. During this period, London became the basis for the further emergence of Britain as one of the world's leading powers. In the 15th century, London underwent tremendous changes. While at the beginning of the century, the city was still recovering from epidemics and conflicts. By the end of the century, it had already become the most important center of Europe, where key political and economic events took place. Henry VIII's accession to power in 1509 opened a new era in London's history, becoming a key moment for the city politically, economically, and culturally. Henry VIII, King of England, who reigned from 1509 to 1547, was a figure who left an indelible mark on the history of London and the whole of England, as well as playing an important role in shaping a uniquely British identity. His reign, while famously brutal and ambitious, brought significant changes to the nation's capital that shaped its future development. At the time of his accession to the throne, Henry VIII inherited a country that had been in a stable position after the reign of his father, Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Henry VIII was an ambitious and determined ruler who not only sought to consolidate his power, but also to introduce major reforms that affected not only the country as a whole, but also the immediate capital, London. His reign was a time of prosperity for the city, but also a time of social change, religious reform, and political transformation that had a lasting impact on London's development. One of Henry VIII's most notable projects was the restoration and expansion of the Palace of Westminster, which was a symbol of royal power and the main center of English parliamentarism. The Palace of Westminster had been partially destroyed during the dynastic wars, but Henry VIII decided to reconstruct it and make it more grand, in keeping with the ambitions of his reign. The rebuilding process began in 1512 when Henry VIII commissioned the architect Henry Jeffrey White to restore this monumental building. As well as expanding the palace itself, Henry VIII also paid attention to improving the surrounding grounds. New buildings and new covered passageways added to the grandeur of the Palace of Westminster, which symbolized the power of the monarchy and its constant presence in London and throughout the country. The reconstruction of the palace also strengthened London's role as the political center of England, as the palace became the site for regular meetings of Parliament and the royal court. From then on, London established itself as the center of legislative power, which greatly strengthened its status as the capital of the kingdom. One of the symbols of royal power and the strengthening of Henry VIII's position in London was the Tower Fortress. Although the tower had been built as early as the 11th century, it under Henry VIII began to expand significantly. Henry rebuilt and strengthened the tower, increasing its role as not only the residence of monarchs, but also as a central prison for the most dangerous enemies of the royal family and the state apparatus. During this period, the tower became a symbol of absolute monarchy and a central point in English political life. The tower also became the site of many political tragedies, including executions and imprisonments. The place retained its importance as a symbol of power, but it also became a symbol of the fear, subjugation, and cruelty inherent in Henry VIII's reign. As the tower continued to expand and strengthen, it epitomized the forces that Henry VIII used to maintain his power in London and throughout the country. One of the most significant events of Henry VIII's reign was his initiative to break with Rome and establish the Church of England, which had a profound effect on London as both the spiritual and political center of the country. Henry's break with the papacy in 1534 was part of a broad religious and political revolution known as the Reformation, which placed London at the epicenter of religious change. Henry VIII initiated reforms to increase his influence over the religious structures in the country and to develop the autonomy of England. London became a crucial center for the spread of new ideas and religious practices. Many monasteries and abbeys were destroyed and their property confiscated in favor of the crown. This greatly changed the face of London, as many of the monasteries that had been in the center of the city were dismantled and new buildings began to be built in their place to meet the new demands of royal authority. As London continued to grow, royal power grew stronger, and new religious institutions were created to establish the Church of England as an alternative to the Catholic Church. Associated with this were not only political changes, but also social ones. Many people who supported Catholicism were persecuted, and London became the site of violent conflicts, including the burning of heretics such as Tom More and John Fox, leading to instability in the city. The reign of Henry VIII was a time of economic prosperity for London. During this period, the city became an important financial center of the country. One of the reasons for this was the active development of trade, which increased due to the strengthening of the position of the monarchy and support from the king. London continued to develop as an international trading center, receiving goods from all over the world, including spices, textiles, goods from the Middle East and Asia. Henry VIII also actively developed the city's infrastructure. An important development was the building of new bridges across the Thames, as well as supporting industry and crafts. This encouraged the development of urban areas such as the city, which housed financial institutions as well as trading and commercial establishments. London continued to develop as England's most important economic center, playing a central role in international trade. Along with the city's economic growth, the social structure also began to strengthen. In London, ties between merchants and the royal court were strengthened, contributing to greater political control and Tudor influence in England's economic life. London became the place where the financial interests of the crown and business converged, reinforcing its status as the main economic and political center of the country. Henry VIII left a deep mark on London's history that was felt not only during his reign, but long after his death in 1547. His reforms, both religious and political, provided the basis for the city's further development and strengthened its role as the capital of England. London, having become an important center of religious, economic, and political life, was already prepared at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign to become a world center that would influence the destinies of people and countries around the world. It was thanks to Henry VIII and his initiatives that London became a place for new ideas and development. and his contribution to the formation of English identity and the future success of the country, which became a symbol of the British Empire, cannot be overestimated. The 17th century was a time of tremendous change for London, a transition from a stable monarchy to revolutionary events that definitively altered the political and social landscape of the country. The clashes between King Charles I and Parliament, which later led to the Civil War, as well as the plague and fire that claimed thousands of lives and destroyed parts of the city, were not only a tragedy but also the source of a new beginning for London. The whole process, against a background of political crises and social change, affected both the urban form and the internal power structure. At the beginning of the 17th century, London was already the most important city in England, but internal conflicts in the country began to gain momentum, especially in matters of power and religion. Revolutionary sentiment in Parliament and among the population began to clash with the monarchy of Charles I, who was trying to increase his power and limit the influence of Parliament. This caused tensions that culminated in the Civil War in 1642. Battles between the King's Army and the parliamentarians, known as Royalists and Puritans. London became an important stronghold of the parliamentarians and a center of resistance to royal authority. This was because London was a major commercial center where more progressive ideas were traditionally supported. Many citizens, especially merchants and artisans, supported Parliament, believing that its victory would ensure their economic well-being and protection from oppressive royal power. The Civil War dragged on for several years, but despite military setbacks, London played an important role in providing an army for Parliament. Parliament, despite its sometimes chaotic organization, was able to build a strong army, led by Oliver Cromwell, and in 1645 the armies of the parliamentary government defeated the royal forces at the Battle of Noseby. After this, London's crucial role as a bastion of parliamentarianism only increased, and the city became the center of the struggle for the country's future. In 1649, after years of conflict, defeat, and political pressure, Charles I was executed in Trafalgar Square. This event was a turning point for England and London, which became a symbol of a new political order, the Republic, established as a result of the Revolution. Oliver Cromwell, a decisive politician and military leader, became the de facto ruler of the country, and London found itself at the center of this historic event. Over the next few years, London underwent a significant transformation. Throughout the period of Republican rule known as the Commonwealth, Cromwell attempted to establish political stability and reform. Although the Republic was asserting itself, Cromwell's power was absolute and many reforms were made to both political and social life. In London, significant changes were taking place despite the crisis situation and ruined economy. Amidst the new political conditions, Cromwell also continued to strengthen London's economy by supporting maritime trade and providing defense against external threats. London's role as the country's main trading center did not diminish despite all the political instability. After the death of Oliver Cromwell in 1658 and the subsequent decline of Republican power in 1660, Charles II returned to the throne as King of England after years of exile. This event marked the beginning of the restoration of the monarchy in England and re-established London as the center of royal power. The restoration brought with it not only political restoration, but also the beginning of new cultural and architectural changes in London. Charles II and his entourage were known for their preference for science, the arts, and architecture. London, once again a monarchical center, became the site of a cultural upsurge. However, this time was also marred by two disasters that shook the capital and changed its landscape. In 1665, London faced one of the worst epidemics in its history, the Great Plague, which was the last major outbreak of the Black Death in Europe. The plague killed more than 100,000 people, nearly a third of the city's population. London's streets emptied, the market shrank, and the city's economy declined. This catastrophic period is remembered not only for the terrible epidemic, but also for the political instability that continued even in the midst of the pandemic. Because of the spread of the disease, the royal court and high society were forced to leave London, which also weakened the cultural life of the city. Against the backdrop of the epidemic, the city became more closed and economic life was brought to a halt, with many stores and stores closing, and many of the city's residents fleeing to the countryside in search of escape. A year after the plague in 1666, London experienced another disaster, the Great Fire of London, which destroyed almost the entire central part of the city. The fire started on September 2nd, 1666, in a bakery on Paddington Street and soon covered large areas. It lasted for 3 days, and as a result, the fire destroyed over 80% of the city, including 87 churches, 13,000 houses, and crucial commercial and cultural institutions. This terrible fire left London in ruins, but it also provided a unique opportunity for the city's dramatic reconstruction. Architects and urban planners such as Christopher Wren were called upon to rebuild London, and it was during this time that the first plans emerged to create more modern and safer areas of the city. One of the most prominent architects of the time was Christopher Wren, who was commissioned to lead the rebuilding of London after the fire. Wren proposed plans to create a new look for the city, including wide streets, new squares, and larger houses. One of his most famous projects was the building of St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the greatest architectural achievements of the time, which became a symbol of rebuilding and a new beginning for London. Wren was also involved in the restoration of many other buildings such as churches, bridges, and public offices. He made a huge contribution to the architectural landscape of the city, and was one of the people who helped London to rebuild and become an important center, not only in England but also in Europe. The 18th century was a crucial period in London's history, a time when the city not only established itself as the political and economic capital of Britain, but also took center stage in world history through its cultural and scientific progress. It was a time of economic growth, flourishing trade, intellectual discovery, and social change. London became the world's largest financial center, as well as a hotbed of Enlightenment ideas, which of course left an indelible mark on the history and development of both the British capital itself and the entire European civilization. London in the 18th century continued to be the most important commercial and financial center of the world. At the beginning of the century, the British Empire began to significantly expand its colonies around the world, which created huge opportunities for trade. The Port of London became the most important hub of world trade, receiving goods and resources from all corners of the earth. London traded extensively with North America, India, Africa, and the Caribbean islands. During this time, the city actively participated in the transatlantic slave trade, which became one of the most lucrative aspects of the British economy, despite the moral and ethical problems associated with the practice. During the first half of the 18th century, London actively developed its relationship with the colonies. The slave trade with Africa, as well as shipments of various goods from India and America, such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee, played an important role in the city's economic development. Foreign trade was supported by naval development and enabled by the growing strength of the Royal Navy, which enabled Britain to establish and consolidate its hegemony on the seas. The City of London in turn became the center of financial transactions, with this huge flow of capital, goods, and resources. The main financial institutions that managed the money of London and the British Empire were banks, including the Bank of England, founded in 1694. Its creation was an important step in the development of Britain's financial system, as well as in stabilizing its economy. The bank became an important player in the international arena, providing loans to the state and individuals, as well as helping to finance trade with the colonies. In addition to economic prosperity, however, the 18th century was also a time of cultural and intellectual flourishing. London became the center of the English Enlightenment, an era that saw the birth of ideas that changed not only the country but the world. This movement involved such prominent figures as the philosopher John Locke, the mathematician and physicist Isaac Newton, the writer and essayist Daniel Defoe, and many other scientists and thinkers whose ideas formed the basis for the development of Western civilization. London in the 18th century continued to be the most important commercial and financial center of the world. At the beginning of the century, the British Empire began to significantly expand its colonies around the world, which created enormous opportunities for trade. The Port of London became the most important hub of world trade, receiving goods and resources from all corners of the earth. London traded extensively with North America, India, Africa, and the Caribbean islands. During this time, the city actively participated in the transatlantic slave trade, which became one of the most lucrative aspects of the British economy, despite the moral and ethical problems associated with the practice. During the first half of the 18th century, London actively developed its relationship with the colonies. The slave trade with Africa, as well as shipments of various goods from India and America, such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee, played an important role in the city's economic development. Foreign trade was supported by naval development and enabled by the growing strength of the Royal Navy, which enabled Britain to establish and consolidate its hegemony on the seas. The City of London, in turn, became the center of financial transactions with this huge flow of capital, goods, and resources. The main financial institutions that managed the money of London and the British Empire were banks, including the Bank of England, founded in 1694. Its creation was an important step in the development of Britain's financial system, as well as in stabilizing its economy. The bank became an important player in the international arena, providing loans to the state and individuals, as well as helping to finance trade with the colonies. In addition to economic prosperity, however, the 18th century was also a time of cultural and intellectual flourishing. London became the center of the English Enlightenment, an era that saw the birth of ideas that changed not only the country but the world. This movement involved such outstanding personalities as the philosopher John Locke, the mathematician and physicist Isaac Newton, the writer and essayist Daniel Defoe, and many other scientists and thinkers whose ideas formed the basis for the development of Western civilization. John Locke was one of the greatest philosophers of the Enlightenment, whose ideas had a huge impact on political philosophy. His works, such as 2 treatises on government, were based on the principles of natural law and human rights. Locke argued that government should be based on consent, which in turn made his writings the basis for the formation of liberal theories and democratic principles. Isaac Newton was one of the most influential scientists of his time, whose discoveries in physics and mathematics became the basis for the science of the future. Newton formulated the laws of motion and the theory of universal gravitation, which radically changed the view of the universe and ushered in a new era in science. London became an important center for scientific debate, and many scientists of the time found inspiration and support in the many scientific societies, such as the Royal Society, which was already in existence and active at the time. Daniel Defoe was an English writer and journalist known for his novel Robinson Crusoe, which was the first important work in the genre of adventure literature. Defoe was also known for his work in political satire and economic studies. His works helped shape the social and political views of the time and left a mark on culture both within Britain and beyond. The culture of London during this period was going through a veritable storm of change. Theater continued to flourish in the city, with famous playwrights such as Richard Sheridan and Oliver Goldsmith, whose plays influenced the development of theater. London also became a center for the arts, with numerous galleries and private collections exhibiting works by famous artists such as William Hogarth and Joshua Reynolds. The capital city attracted talented people from all over the world, which contributed to the development of science, art, and literature. In the 18th century, London also witnessed significant social change. Population growth, both in the city itself and in its suburbs, created a need for new residential and commercial neighborhoods. The construction of houses and palaces continued on a large scale. New streets, squares, buildings, and developed infrastructure became an integral part of London's appearance. The rapid expansion of the city led to the creation of new working-class neighborhoods and neighborhoods for the poor, which in turn led to increased social tensions. The working class of London in the 18th century began to fight for their rights. Working conditions were often appalling. Children and adults worked in dangerous conditions in factories and the port, in mines and on building sites. Trade unions, although not officially recognized at the time, began to gradually establish the first organized groups to defend workers' interests. One of the most famous movements was the labor law reform movement, which eventually led to new laws governing labor rights. Social problems such as poverty, unemployment, and poor housing conditions also led to a rise in protest in London, which began to manifest itself in revolutionary sentiments to which the entire city responded. At this time, new social reforms began to be developed to improve the living conditions of the poorest sections of the population. An important milestone in the economic development of the city was the creation of the London Stock Exchange and the strengthening of financial activity in the city. The emergence of stock markets and exchange operations opened new horizons for British investors, and London became a world financial center. By the end of the 18th century, London was the most important center for trading in stocks and securities, as well as for international trade in goods. The British system of financial assistance, supported by the Bank of England, played a key role in the success of industry and trade in Britain. The 18th century was a golden age for London, as the city consolidated its position as a global financial, cultural, and political center. It was a period of not only economic growth, but also cultural and intellectual change. London became the stage for prominent figures of the time, such as John Locke, Isaac Newton, and Daniel Defoe, and became a crucial hub for scientific, philosophical, and cultural debate. The city's economic power, supported by strong trade and finance, allowed Britain to assert its hegemony in the world and continue to dominate global politics. The 19th century was an era of dramatic transformation for London, as the city underwent industrialization and became the largest, fastest-growing city in the world. It was during this period, amidst social and economic change, that London gained its status as a world center and embodied many of the characteristics of the Victorian era, which was marked by progress but also profound social injustice. The beginning of the 19th century for London meant the transition from the old agrarian economy to an industrial one. The construction of the railroads played a crucial role in the expansion of the city and the creation of a new infrastructural image. One of the most important steps in this process was the opening of the first railroad in London in 1836. This was the section from St. Pancras Station to Farringdon Station, and it became the basis for the further development of the rail network that connected London with other major British cities and continental Europe. Before the end of the 19th century, the rail network had expanded considerably, through which goods, people, and resources could move faster than ever before. As early as 1863, the world's first subway line was opened in London, which solved the problems of traffic congestion and made London the first city where mass use of underground transportation became the norm. The development of rail and transport links greatly accelerated London's economic growth. During this period, the city experienced a veritable storm of construction. Many factories, warehouses, railroad stations, and new residential neighborhoods appeared. Many businesses sprouted up in and around the City of London area, from weaving mills to steel mills. By mid-century, London had become Britain's largest industrial center and one of the most urbanized cities in the world. The construction of new factories, mills, and residences led to an intensive expansion of the city, which was no longer just a city but a true metropolis. By 1850, London's population had passed 2 million, and by 1900, the figure had doubled to over 6 million. This was an impressive increase in population that fueled rapid economic growth, but also created many social and infrastructural problems. In the 19th century, London became the principal city of the British Empire, the greatest world empire of the time, which controlled colonies on every continent. London became not only the political but also the economic center of the empire, as trading companies, banks, and financial institutions, such as the Bank of England, managed the wealth flowing from Africa, India, North America, and other colonies. One of the most important factors that allowed London to become the financial center of the world was its position in global trade. The Port of London in particular became a crucial hub for transatlantic trade, linking Britain with its colonies in the Americas, India, and the Caribbean. Food, sugar, tobacco, coffee, and textiles all flowed into London, supplying the country with essential goods and making the city the world's premier trading center. The money earned from trade was used to further expand the urban areas and improve infrastructure. Huge warehouses and trading houses began to spring up in London, where business transactions with foreign markets took place. Important banks such as Barclays and Lloyds became global giants of the financial industry. British merchants and bankers provided the main capital flows in the empire, which allowed Britain to not only maintain its global hegemony but also to increase its economic power. In addition, during this period, London became the center of cultural life of the British Empire. The city boasted magnificent theaters, art galleries, and cultural clubs, making it a center of both financial and cultural development. While London was actively undergoing industrialization, its status as a world cultural center was also being consolidated. Despite tremendous economic growth, London in the 19th century faced many social problems, including poverty, overcrowding, and filthy streets. The emergence of factory districts in the city center and a significant increase in urban population led to deteriorating living conditions for most city dwellers. Many workers congregated in working-class neighborhoods such as Stratford, Shoreditch, and Bethnal Green, contributing to the spread of diseases such as cholera and tuberculosis. Living conditions for the working class were extremely difficult. Filthy, overcrowded neighborhoods with poor quality housing and lack of sanitation. Residents of these neighborhoods often worked in factories where working conditions were extremely harsh, and the workday could last 12 to 14 hours. Children also often worked in factories because they were cheap laborers. These conditions helped create social tensions that led to important reforms in the future, such as the passage of the Labor Rights Act in 1833, which restricted child labor, and other laws regulating working conditions. In addition, the growing industrialization of the city led to environmental and sanitary problems. Air and water pollution became a significant problem for London, contributing to the spread of epidemics. Dirty rivers and unauthorized landfills became a constant threat to the health of the city's citizens. Despite these problems, the era of Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901, was a time of significant social reform and political change. The Victorian era was a time of striving to improve people's lives through various reforms. Education for children became more accessible, enabling many people previously restricted by poverty to gain a basic education and move beyond the working class. From 1870, the Public Education Act came into effect, which guaranteed children access to free education. Health reforms also began, and the first sanitation works appeared, including the establishment of public toilets and improved water and sewage systems. In this context, one of the most important figures was Joseph Bazalgette, an engineer who designed and built a sewerage system that greatly improved London's sanitation and reduced the incidence of disease. Significant changes also took place in social life, with reforms in women's rights beginning to take place. Women during this period began to push for the right to education, participation in public life, and the right to vote. From 1832, the struggle for electoral reform also began, which gave the opportunity to participate in elections to a wider range of citizens, including members of the middle class. The cultural life of London in the 19th century was very rich. During this period, the British Museum was founded, 1753, which became one of the largest and most important museums in the world. The most important works of art, scientific collections, and archaeological finds from all over the world were gathered here. Also in London, theater continued to develop, including through great playwrights such as Charles Dickens and George Eliot. The literary heritage of this time became an important part of world culture. Dickens, particularly in his novels such as Oliver Twist and Great Expectations, reflected all the contradictions of the era while serving as a voice for the poor and oppressed. By the end of the 19th century, London had become one of the largest and most diverse cities in the world, with a full range of opportunities for different classes and nationalities. It was a time of economic, social, and cultural prosperity, despite the many difficulties faced by its inhabitants. The 19th century was thus a time of transformation and controversy for London, a time of rapid growth and a parallel increase in social problems. It was a period in which the city became a world center, but was also tested by industrialization, population growth, and social issues. The 20th century was a period of profound change for London. The city went through several phases of modernization and faced the challenges of world wars, globalization, and social change. During this time, London continued to grow, becoming the cultural and economic center of the world. But at the same time, it was subjected to many challenges that changed its face. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, had a huge impact on London, although the city itself did not become the scene of hostilities. However, London was at the center of all military activity in Britain and the British Empire. as it was the most important strategic and financial hub for the empire. The city was the center of planning for military operations as well as the main base for supplying the army. London became an important communications and transportation hub, where key structures of the British government and military command were concentrated. During the war, London experienced major social and economic changes. Millions of Britons went to the front, leaving their jobs behind. This led to a marked reduction in the labor force, but at the same time it opened up new opportunities for women, who began working in industries, replacing men. Women worked in factories, on the railroads, as well as on transportation lines and in healthcare. This period was a turning point in the history of feminism and the social emancipation of women. The active participation of women in the economic life of Britain led to a widespread public awareness of their contribution to the working process, which then became the basis for a change in the status of women in society. After the end of the First World War in 1918, the Electoral Act was passed giving women over the age of 30 the right to vote, which was a significant step towards gender equality in the political life of the country. London's economy during the war was organized in close connection with the needs of the front. The city became the center of army supply and arms production, as well as the main logistical hub for the British Empire. London's shipyards and factories labored for the needs of the war, supplying ammunition, weapons, and other military equipment. The city also became an important point for medical care. Numerous hospitals received wounded soldiers, and nurses and doctors greatly boosted public morale. However, the war also took a significant material and social toll on London. Thousands of people, including civilians, were killed or injured. As a consequence of the long-term war effort, the city experienced economic hardship, rising public expenditure, inflation, and lack of resources. This, in turn, led to a deterioration in living standards for a large part of the population, especially the working class. After the end of the war, London faced a number of serious economic problems. Inflation, mass unemployment, and economic instability plagued the city. Many businesses were unable to recover from the devastation caused by the war, as well as the pent-up demand for products. The UK economy was hit hard, and in the early years of the post-war period, London endured the hardships of rebuilding production and infrastructure. Nevertheless, despite the hardships, a vigorous effort to rebuild the city began. Many efforts were made to modernize the transportation system and develop new public buildings. The construction of new residential and commercial neighborhoods was an important element of the city's recovery. For example, the London Underground was extended in the 1920s, and bus routes and rail services continued to be improved. This greatly improved transport accessibility and provided cities with a new level of mobility. In 1929, the world was hit by the Great Depression, which affected London as well. Following the global economic crisis, the UK went through a period of deep economic decline. Jobs began to disappear and unemployment rates in the capital skyrocketed. This led to mass protests and demonstrations. Social instability became a serious problem in the 1930s, and London faced difficult living conditions, including housing shortages and deteriorating sanitation. However, despite economic difficulties, London continued to develop technically and culturally. One of the significant steps in the modernization of the city was the development of road and rail transport. At this time, the mass popularization of automobiles began, which led to significant changes in the city's infrastructure. London's streets and roads began to be built to meet the new demands of the growing number of cars. This also contributed to an increased demand for gasoline as well as the development of new retail and logistics businesses. In addition, the 1930s saw the foundations laid for further development of the aviation and railroad industries in London. For example, London Heathrow Airport was opened in 1936, which later became one of the largest aviation hubs in the world. Also during this period, work continued on improving the London Underground, which became an important component of the city's transportation system. London's architecture also underwent significant changes during this period. Unlike previous centuries when most buildings were constructed in the traditional Victorian or Georgian styles, the 1920s and 1930s were the heyday of Art Deco and modernism. Examples of these buildings can be seen in downtown areas such as Rogers House and the British Museum. This was a reflection of innovative ideas and the city's desire to adapt to the new conditions of modern life. At the same time, older buildings such as the Palace of Westminster and Big Ben were also preserved, which remained symbols of British power and stability during these years of economic instability. Regardless of economic hardship, London continued to be an important cultural center. During the 1920s and 1930s, the city experienced a flourishing of art and literature. Many famous writers, such as Virginia Woolf and George Orwell, lived and worked in London during this period, and their work left a significant mark on literary culture. London's theaters, including the famous Globe and the Royal London Theatre, continued to attract audiences and became centers of cultural exchange. Thus, despite economic crises and the effects of World War I, London continued to develop and adapt to new conditions. In the 1920s and 1930s, the city remained an important center, not only for the British economy but also for world cultural and scientific progress. This was a period of significant social and technological change that prepared London for further prosperity in the post-war period. When World War II broke out in 1939, London was once again at the center of global events. It was a period when the city experienced the devastating effects of war, far more so than in the First World War. London became a key target for Nazi Germany, which left a deep mark on the city's history. The main symbol of fear and destruction was the famous Blitz, a series of intense air raids that enemy forces began in 1940 and continued until May 1941. During this period, German bombing raids hit urban areas brutally at night, and significant areas were destroyed. For 57 nights, Londoners endured the heaviest bombardments. Entire neighborhoods collapsed. Critical infrastructure was destroyed, including famous historic buildings such as the Palace of Westminster, St. Paul's Cathedral, Big Ben, and bridges over the Thames. Fires caused by bombs destroyed homes, businesses, and cultural monuments. The Port of London, with its strategic role, became one of the most attack-prone areas. Despite massive destruction and loss of life, London showed exceptional resilience. In spite of threats and constant danger, the city's inhabitants continued to live, work, and fight. Londoners began to live under the constant din of sirens and spent many nights in bomb shelters, but they never gave up hope. Nevertheless, the destruction and loss of housing was one of the main problems the city faced during the war. In the face of the war, many of the city's residents, including women and children, took part in the defense and support of the city. Women not only replaced men in the workplace, but were also active in civil defense, working in evacuation, firefighting, and other important tasks. Preparing and delivering food, transporting the wounded, rescuing people from destroyed buildings, all of this became part of everyday life during the Blitz. In 1945, with the end of the war, London experienced the long-awaited liberation, but also faced the disastrous consequences of war. Thousands of people were killed, cities were destroyed, and the economy was on the brink of collapse. Nevertheless, after the war, the active reconstruction of the city began, which took decades. It became not only a necessity, but also a step towards a new era for London. Today, London is a mega-city that continues to evolve and face new challenges such as housing problems, social inequality, and global politics. But despite all the challenges, London remains one of the most influential cities in the world, combining a rich historical heritage with the most modern achievements. The city was strategically important to the UK, and rebuilding it meant not only physical recovery but also a return to normalcy. The post-war years saw the construction of new residential areas, the rebuilding of infrastructure, and the preservation of historic monuments and cultural sites. After the end of the Second World War, London became a place where key political and social changes took place. One of the most important developments affecting social welfare was the National Health Service, NHS Act, founded in 1948. The NHS offered free healthcare to all citizens, an important step in UK social policy. This was part of the Socialist program, developed by Clement Attlee's government, and had a significant impact on the living standards of citizens. One of the most significant processes that began to take place in London in the post-war years was the wave of immigration. London began to attract people from all over the world, especially from the former British colonies. Indians, Jamaicans, Pakistanis, and other people from African and Asian countries began arriving in London in search of work and a better life. These immigrants played a key role in shaping the multicultural image of the city, which is one of its hallmarks today. A significant number of immigrants began working in the construction of new neighborhoods, in public transportation, and in the service and health sectors. London's migration processes in the 1950s and 1960s influenced its social structure and culture, making the city one of the most multicultural and cosmopolitan metropolitan areas in the world. By the 1970s, London found itself in the midst of new economic and social crises. The economic crisis of the 1970s, caused by the energy crisis and inflation, hit the city's industrial working-class neighborhoods first. Inflation and rising unemployment became major problems, and economic instability led to increased social tensions. Social protests also emerged at this time, particularly those related to the fight against racial discrimination. Mass protests against inequality and for minority rights began in London. Movements aimed at improving the legal position of immigrants and minorities were particularly active, which affected the political life of the city and the country as a whole. In the 1980s, London began to recover again, thanks to the economic reforms introduced by Margaret Thatcher's government. These reforms included privatization of state-owned enterprises, deregulation, and cuts in social spending, which encouraged the growth of the private sector and economic activity in the city. During this time in London, its status as a global financial center was greatly enhanced. The City of London became an important international financial and business hub. The city's markets and banks attracted investment from around the world, and real estate values in central London continued to rise. In 2000, London continued to be one of the largest financial centers in the world, thanks to high rates of financial technology development, such as financial startups, and the development of innovative financial services companies. However, along with economic prosperity, London faced new challenges related to globalization and security threats. One of the most traumatic events in London's history in the 21st century was the terrorist attacks that occurred on July 7, 2005. A series of bombings on the London Underground and on buses killed more than 50 people and injured hundreds more. These terrorist attacks, which became known as the London July 7th attacks, left a deep imprint on the minds of the city's citizens and reminded them of the fragility of security in a globalized world. They were the moment when London, like other major metropolitan areas around the world, realized how important efforts to combat terrorism and preserve internal security are. In recent years, London has also faced the consequences of political changes in the UK, especially with the referendum on the UK's exit from the European Union in 2016. The UK's decision to leave the EU has caused political, economic, and social upheaval that has affected London as well. The city, as a major financial center, faced uncertainty related to future trade and financial relations with Europe. Brexit has been an important element in shaping the new political landscape of the country and the city. Despite the political challenges, London continues to be an important financial and cultural center. The city is adapting to new technological trends, such as artificial intelligence and blockchain technology, and continues to play an important role in the global economy. In the tech sector, London has become a leader in the development of innovative startups, especially in fintech, and attracts entrepreneurs and investors from around the world. Thanks for watching. Subscribe.